In this demo, we want to write a simple class for books that can handle variables and operations on such an object. So we start by class definition. We have the keyword class, name of the class, braces, and then we have semicolon. We start by declaring variables or data members of this class. So we need to have a string title, another string for author, and then an integer for number of pages. In all the examples that we saw together, we define members in private or public regions. But what happens if we just put all the members in the class without any order or classification? So I'm going to create an object of this class, and probably we can access the members using dot operator. So I'm going to set the title and then set the author and set a random number of pages. And then I'm just gonna try to print these values to see if it works. The error we got here is that these variables are private. So if we don't specify if a member is private or public, the compiler considers it as a private member. So if we want to access these variables, we need to declare them as public members. Now we can have access to these variables, set them, and read them. But as we learned in this lecture, it's better to define data members as private members and then try to initialize, modify, or read them using member functions. Before modifying the class definition, let's comment these couple of lines to see the initial values of these variables. So the first two variables are empty, and number of pages contains a random value. So we could also simply set the initial values like this. So here we initialize the first two variables with an empty string and the number of pages with 0. Now let's make these data members private, and for each of them we are going to define a setter and getter. The return type of setter is void, and then we are going to set the title. In order to set the title, we need a string as an input. And this function is not constant because we are going to modify a variable in it. What about the getter? The return type of getter is a string. The name of the function can be getTitle. It doesn't need any argument And since it's not going to modify any variable, we can define it as a constant function. Now let's define these functions. So for the full definition of function, we need the name of the class with 2 columns for both of these functions. For set title, we need to update the value of title with a given string, which I'm going to rename it to T. And for get title, we just need to return title. Now we can use these 2 functions to set the value of title here. So we can have b set title and pass the title of the book as an argument. Similarly, we can have b dot get title to read the value. Now we can define similar functions for the other 2 data members. So we can have void set author string a and then string get author constant, and finally we can have void set number of pages with an integer arguments and also int get number of pages, which is a constant function. So I'm just gonna copy these 2 and update them. So this one should be author and we set author to A, and then we have get author and we return the value, and we have set number of pages string number, and we set number of pages with none, and here we will have get number of pages and we return number of pages. So I'm gonna update here as well. So we call set author with a string as an argument, also set number of pages with an integer as an argument, and here we call get author and get number of pages to read the values. Now we have the same output using setter and getter functions. These functions is just to protect our data and in order to just make sure that we don't modify data when we don't want to. Now let's declare a constructor. So let's declare this constructor book. It's supposed to have the same name as a class itself, and it doesn't have any return type. And since I need it to be the default constructor, it doesn't have any arguments. So I'm gonna define it here. So we will have book, 2 columns, book without any arguments. Inside this function, we are gonna set title to no title, author to no author, and number of pages to 0. So let's just comment these 3 lines and run the code. So now when we create an object of this class, this constructor will be called, and these values will be used to initialize the data members. We can also overload the constructor and define a version in which we can set the values at declaration time. So we can have a string title and a string author and integer number of pages. So here we are gonna overload this function and we are gonna set title to T, author to A, and number of pages to none. Here I'm gonna create another object of this class, B2. And then I think it's better to define a print function here, void print. And then we're gonna have void book print cout title author and number of pages. So I'm gonna create B2 with these arguments. And print B1 and B2. So here for B1, the default constructor will be called, and we set the values to no title, no author, and 0. But for B2, the second constructor will be called, and we set the values to the input arguments. So we can also merge these 2 functions using default values. So we can comment this one and set default values for this constructor. So we don't need this one anymore. And if we run the code, we will have the same results. So again, the first object will be initialized with no title, no author, 0. And for the second one, we use the input arguments.